Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Holla for a dollar, strip for a tip. This is your girl JOE. It is still the month of October, and I said I was gonna give y'all what I was gonna give y'all a total of 31 episodes, and I am going in for y'all. Okay, I'm sorry for the delay. I'm sorry that I am behind, but I'm definitely gonna give you any and all of the episodes that I am recording. So let's get into today's episode. Warning, this podcast is for mature audience. It contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult content, strong language. Viewer discretion is advised. All right, so today's episode is about the killer clown by the name of John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March the 17th, 1942. He was the second child and the only son to John Stanley Gacy and Maureen Robinson. His father was a auto repair mechanic in World War One, and he was a veteran. His mother was a homemaker. Gacy's Ancestry.com said that he was Polish and Danish, but his family definitely practiced Catholic beliefs. His paternal parents pronounced their last name as Gatza, Gacy. And they basically immigrated to the United States from Poland. They made sure that they parted ways from Germany. Gacy was close to his mother and his two sisters, and he very much had a difficult relationship with his father because his father became physically and verbally abusive, and he was alcoholic. His father belittled him. Words are very powerful, so his dad used to say, "You're dumb, you're stupid," and used to compare him to his sisters a lot. One of Gacy's earliest memories was that his father would beat him with a leather belt, and it was because he accidentally disarranged components of a car engine that his father actually assembled. Of course, his mother was being a mom, and she basically tried to shield him from the father's abuse as much as possible. But because she intervened with the relationship between father and son, his father deemed him as a sissy, a mama's boy, and thought that he would be queer later on in life. Despite all the mistreatment, he still had love for his father, but he always just felt that I'm never good enough. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy was caught sexually fondling a young girl. His father ended up beating him so bad as punishment, and that same year, a family friend and a contractor who would sometimes molest Gacy in a truck. Gacy never told his father about it because he would feel like he would be the one to be blamed because of his father, having the anger and the abusive transgression towards him. Gacy ended up being overweight and he was very unathletic as a child. He did have a heart condition and he was also told to avoid all sports in school. During fourth grade, Gacy began experiencing a lot of blackouts. He was hospitalized occasionally because he would have episodes. What ended up happening is the doctor really basically laid it out there and told the parents of Gacy that between 14 and 18, he would spend almost a year in the hospital and decline. He would miss a lot of school because he would be in the hospital. His father suspected these episodes were effort to gain sympathy and attention and openly accused his son of faking a condition, and Gacy laid in the hospital bed. Although his mothers and sisters and a few close friends never doubted the illness, Gacy's medical condition was never diagnosed properly. So every time he went to the hospital, they ran a bunch of tests. They did a bunch of CAT scans, but they could never pinpoint exactly what was going on. One of Gacy's high school friends recalled several instances when his father beat his son without Gacy provoking him. On one occasion in 1957, he witnessed Gacy's father emerging drunk from the family basement and began belittling, and then he was hitting his son for no apparent reason. Gacy's mother attempted to intervene as her son simply put up his hands to defend himself. According to the friend, Gacy never struck his father back during this altercation. In 1960, at the age of 18, Gacy became involved in politics. He worked as an assistant for the Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood, and this kind of led more criticism from his father, who accused his son of being a patsy. Gacy later speculated his decision to become involved in politics was actually to seek acceptance from other people and his father. That same year, political involvement began, and his father bought him a car. He kept the vehicle title in his name until Gacy finished paying for it. These monthly payments actually took several years for him to complete, and his father confiscated the keys to the vehicle if Gacy didn't do as he asked him to do. In April of 1962, Gacy purchased an extra set of keys after his father confiscated the original ones. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the components for 3 days. Gacy recalled he felt totally sick and drained after the incident. He ends up moving to Las Vegas. Hours after his father replaced the distributor caps back onto his car, Gacy left home and drove to Las Vegas, Nevada. He found work within the ambulance service before he was transferred to work as a attendant at Palm Mortuary. As a mortuary attendant, Gacy slept on a cot behind the embalming room. He worked there for 3 months, observing embalming dead bodies and occasionally serving as a pallbearer. Gacy later confessed that one evening, while alone, he had climbed into a coffin of a deceased teen male, embraced and caressed the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This prompted to call his mother, and the next day asked whether his father would allow him to return home. His father agreed, and that same day he ended up driving back to Chicago. As he was returning home back to Chicago, Gacy ended up enrolling into Northwestern Business College. Despite having failed to graduate high school, he graduated in 1963 and ended up taking a management trainee position at a shoe company. In 1964, the shoe company transferred to Springfield, Illinois to better the company as a whole, and he ended up working as a salesman and eventually got promoted to manager of his department. In March of that year, he became engaged to a Marilyn Myers, a co-worker of his. During their courtship, Gacy joined the local GACYs and worked tireless for them, being named keyman in April of 1964. That same year, he had a second homosexual experience. According to Gacy, after one of his colleagues in Springfield basically gave him a drink and invited him to spend the evening on his sofa, he agreed. The colleague performed oral sex on him, and he was drunk. By 1965, Gacy had risen to the position of vice president of the shoe company. That same year, he was named the third outstanding person for GACY in the state of Illinois. After 6 months courtship, Gary and Myers ended up getting married September of 1964. Marilyn's father subsequently purchased his third KFC restaurant in Iowa. The couple moved there so GACY could manage the restaurant, with the understanding that he would move into the Marilyn's parents' former home, which they had been vacated for years before he even made that decision with him and his new wife. They offered a lucrative amount. They basically said that Gary would receive $15,000 per year. Right now, 2022, it would be equivalent $134,000 plus shares of the restaurant's profit. Following the obligation and completion of basically any management courses that he needed to take, GACY ended up relocating to Waterloo with his wife. He opened up a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although GACY's employees were teenagers of both sexes at his restaurant, he socialized only with the young men. GACY gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances, and if he had any issues, he would claim his advances were simply jokes or a test of moral. And GACY's wife ended up giving birth to their first son, February of 1966, and a daughter in March of 1967. GACY later described this period of his life as to be perfect. He has finally earned his father's approval. When GACY's parents paid a family visit in July of 1966, his father privately apologized for physically, emotionally abusing him and inflicting very internal pain throughout his son's childhood and adolescence before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you," as he shook GACY's hand. Of course, that was never enough. So, in August of 1967, GACY sexually assaulted a 15-year-old by Donald Voorhees. I'm probably saying his last name wrong, but it's Voorhees. Don't judge me, judge your mama hoe, okay? The son of a fellow GACY. Gary lured this man in his home upon the promise of showing him heterosexual stage films regularly played at GACY's events. Gary applied so much into this young man's head, and he gave him a lot of alcohol and allowed him to watch the stage movies, then pursued him and engaged in oral sex, adding, "You have to have sex with a man before you start having sex with women." Over the following months, Gary similarly did the same abusive acts to several young youth, including ones who encouraged to have sex with him and his wife. So basically, they would try to blackmail him into performing oral sex on him. GACY tricked several teenagers into believing he was conditioned to having homosexual experiences and interested in scientific research, and paid them $50 each. Now, if that ain't crazy, I don't know what is. In March of 1968, the first young man who he assaulted reported to his father that GACY had sexually assaulted him. Basically, the young man told his dad, and the dad immediately informed the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him for oral sodomy of the first young man that he raped, and attempted assault of a 16-year-old by the name of Edwin Lynch. So Gacy, he denied the charges and demanded to take a polygraph test. The results basically indicated that he was nervous when he denied any wrongdoing and any relationships with both of these young men. Gacy publicly denied any of the wrongdoing and insisted the charges against him were politically motivated. The father of the first young man that was assaulted opposed that Gacy be nominated for appointing as president of Iowa. Several fellow JCs followed Gacy's story and basically supported him no matter what. However, in May 10th of 1968, Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charges. On August the 30th, 1968, Gacy pursued one of his employees, an 18-year-old Russell, to physically assault the first young man that he basically sodomized. And Gacy promised to pay Russell $300. Russell agreed, and in early September, he lured the first guy that he assaulted in an isolated country park, sprayed him with mace in his eyes, and beat him. The young man escaped and reported the assault to the police and identified that Russell as his attacker. They arrested him the following day. While initially, basically, bruh man was denying everything. He was like, I don't have nothing to do with it. And basically, Russell ended up confessing that the assault on the first young man was indicated that he was doing it upon the request of Mr. Gacy. Police arrested Gacy again and laid additional charges on him for hiring Russell to assault and intimidate the first young man. On September the 12th, Gacy was ordered to undergo a psychic evaluation at a psychic hospital in the University of Iowa. 2 doctors examined him over a period of 7 days before concluding he had a personality disorder. The the clinical term would be a sociopath, okay? And it was basically unlikely to benefit from any therapy or medical treatment, and his behavior patterns were likely to bring him a repeat conflict with society. So the doctor concluded he was mentally competent to stand trial, which means he didn't have a choice. In November the 7th of 1968, Gary pleaded guilty on 1 count of sodomy and in relation to the first 15-year-old that he assaulted, but not guilty to the charges relating to the other young man that he assaulted or that brought up charges against him. Gary claimed that Russell, the guy he hired, had offered him to basically do this act itself, to basically beat on the young man himself. His story was not believable, of course, and Gary ended up being convicted of sodomy on December the 3rd. He was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment to be served in Alsama State Penitentiary. The same day, Gary's wife petitioned the divorce and requested she be awarded the couple's home, sole custody of their 2 children, and alimony. The court ruled in her favor, and the divorce was final on September the 18th, 1969. Gary never saw his first wife or children again. During the basically his incarceration, Gary uh, acquired model prisoners within months of his arrival. He had been risen to the position of head cook. He also joined an inmate in that chapter to increase membership from 50 to 650 men in less than 18 months. He is known to have secured and increased an inmate's daily pay in prison's mess hall. And basically, he was a spokesman of getting a better pay for prison inmates who not only did work in the kitchen, but did work everywhere. So GACY had overseen the installations of the miniature golf course and in the prison recreation yard. So in June of 1969, GACY was denied parole to prepare for a second scheduled parole hearing that May of 1970. So that following year, he ended up completing 16 high school courses for which he attained his diploma in 1969. On Christmas Day, 1969, Gary's father died, and it was because of liver corrosion. Basically, he drank himself to death, basically. When informed that his father had died, Gary collapsed on the floor and was sobbing. His request for supervised compassion leave to attend his funeral was denied. He ended up returning to Chicago. Gary was granted parole within 12 months of 12 months of probation on June the 18th, 1970. After he served the 18 months of his 10-year sentence, conditions of his probations included that Gary had to live in Chicago with his mother, and he must be observed, and he had a 10 p.m. curfew. On his release, Gary basically told his fellow friends from the GACY Clarence Lane, which is the cult that he was with. They ended up picking him up from prison and had remanded to basically stick by his side and believe that Gary was innocent no matter what, that he would never go back to jail, and they would basically help him reestablish himself in Waterloo. However, within 24 hours of his release, Gary had relocated to Chicago, and he arrived there on June the 19th, and shortly he obtained a job as a short order cook in a restaurant. So they made sure that when he got out that he was basically set up and he was good to go. On February the 12th, 1971, Gary was charged with sexual assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that he lured him into his car in Chicago Greyhound bus terminal and drove him to his home, where he had attempted to force the boy to have sex with him. The court dismissed the complaint when the boy failed to appear. On June the 22nd, GACY was arrested again and charged for aggravated sexual battery, reckless conduct. The arrest was in response to the complaint filed by the youth who had claimed that Gary had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him in the car, forced him to have oral sex. Then charges were dropped after the complaint attempted to blackmail GACY. An Iowa board parole did not learn about any of these incidents, and 8 months later, on October 1971, Gary's parole ended. The following month's records of Gary's previous criminal history were sealed. Ain't that about a bitch? With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought a ranch house, and it was near the village of Norridge and Norwood Park Township. And it was basically the metropolitan part of Chicago. He resided at an address, and this is the address 18. Sorry about that. The address is 8213 West Somerdale Avenue until he was arrested again, December the 9th, 1978. And according to Gacy, he committed all his murders there. So, Gacy was actively located in his community, being helpful towards neighbors. He was willing to loan them construction tools and everything. So he was basically a community activist and was luring people in and killing them. So between 1974 and 1978, he hosted an annual summer party, something he did almost every year. And he basically devoted a theme and invited hundreds of people and politicians to his home. The same home that supposedly that he, murdered people in. Gary ended up getting married the second time and a divorce in 1971 in August. Shortly after Gacy and his mothers moved out of the house, he became engaged to a lady named Carol, whom he had believed he dated in high school. They were married on July the 1st, 1972. Carol and her two young daughters from a previous marriage moved into Gacy's home soon after the couple announced their engagement. His mother moved out of the house shortly before the wedding. In 1975, Gacy was told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had sex on Mother's Day that year, he informed her that that would be the last time they would ever have sex. He began spending most of his evenings away from home, only to return early hours of the morning. Basically, Carol observed Gacy bringing teenage boys into the garage in early hours and found gay porn and men's wallets and identifications inside the home. When she confronted him, who do all these things belong to, basically? He informed her angrily, "It is none of your damn business." Following the heated argument, she failed to balance the checkbooks, so correctively, in October of 1975, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed to his wife's request, although by mutual consent. She continued to live in the house until February of 1976, when she and her daughters moved into their own apartment. 1 month later, on March the 2nd, Gacy divorced and decreed upon false grounds, and Gacy basically wanted to make sure that everything was final. He didn't want to be with women anymore. That was it for him. In 1971, Gacy established a part-time construction business called PDM Contractors. This initial PDM were for painting, decorating, and maintenance. With the approval of his probation officer, Gacy worked evenings on his construction contracts while working as a cook during the day. Initially, he undertook minor repairs, working on such things as little signed contracts written for concrete and redecorating, but later on he expanded and he included bigger projects like interior designing, remodeling, installation, assembling, landscaping. In the mid-1973, Gary ended up quitting his job as a cook because he was fully committed to the construction business. So you think that he had rehabilitated at that point. In 1975, PDM ended up expanding at a rapid pace. He was working up to 16-hour days at that point. And in 1977, he became a supervisor of PE system and firm specialized in remodeling the drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, Gacy worked on up to 4 projects and he frequently traveled state to state. By 1978, PDM had an annual salary of $200,000. So Mr. Gacy had a local membership with the Moose Club. Gacy became aware of Jolly the Joker. Basically, he was the clown of the club whose member regularly performed at, fundraiser events and additional volunteering and entertaining at the hospital with the children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the clown club and created his own character, Pogo, Pogo the clown, and Patches the clown. Basically, he would do his own makeup and costumes. He described Pogo as a happy clown, where Patches was more serious. Gacy earned money from his performance and then later on said that acting as a clown allowed him to basically recreate certain parts of his childhood that he felt like should have been happy. He performed as Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, hospitals, and sometimes Gacy would basically remain in clown performance. He would briefly drink beers at local bars before returning home, and Gacy volunteered public services as a clown throughout the years of the murders, and he was known as the Killer Clown. Much of PDM's workforce consisted of high school students and young men. Gacy would offer positions for workers in order to have sex. So he insisted that they would do sexual favors for him, and in return, he would do stuff for them like lend them the company vehicle, financial assets, or promotions. Gary also claimed that he owned a gun. Once telling some of the employees, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you? And how easy it would be to get rid of the body?" And a lot of that time, that line would basically scare them into doing the acts. In 1974, Gacy and a teenage employee traveled to Florida and viewed a property Gacy had purchased. On the first night in Florida, Gacy raped the employee in their hotel room. After returning to Chicago, the employee drove to Gacy's house and beat him in his yard. Gacy told his wife he had attacked for refusing to pay him for poor quality painting. In 1975, Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony. 2 months later, he went to Anthony's home knowing the youth had injured his foot in an accident the previous day to drink a bottle of wine and watch heterosexual stage films. Before Gary ended up wrestling Anthony to the floor, cuffed his hand behind his back. He wrestled Gary to the floor and obtained possession of the handcuff key. The cuffs Anthony ended up cuffing Gary's hand behind his back. And at first, Gacy threatened Anthony to calm down and promised to leave if he removed the cuff. Anthony agreed and Gacy left. Anthony later recalled that Gacy told him, "Not only are you the only one who got out of the cuffs, you got them on me." So he was a little shocked. I guess that kind of like scared him a little bit, but not too much. So in July the 26th, 1976, Gacy picked up an 18-year-old by the name of David, who was, of course, a hitchhiker, trying to hitchhike to Elston Avenue. Gacy offered him a job at PDM, and he began working that same evening. On August the 21st, David moved into Gacy's house. The next day, David and Gacy had several drinks to celebrate his 19th birthday, and Gacy dressed up as Pogo, the clown, and basically put handcuffs on David. His cuffed wrist, he cuffed one wrist in front of his body and ended up putting it behind his body, and he swung David around while holding the chain link, the chain link that was between the two cuffs. Then he said he intended to rape him, and David kicked GACY in the face and freed himself from the handcuffs. A month later, GACY appeared at David's bedroom door, intending to rape him, saying, "Dave, you really don't know who I am. Maybe it would be good if you gave me what I want." David resisted. GACY ended up leaving the bedroom and stated, "You ain't no fun." David moved out October the 5th and left PDM, although he did periodically work for GACY over the following 2 years. Shortly after David moved out of GACY's house, another employee, an 18-year-old by Michael, he ended up moving in. Michael ended up working for PDM May 1976. He lived with GACY until April of 77. Now, Michael sometimes assisted GACY in clowning and grand openings of businesses. So GACY as Pogo and Michael as Patches. So GACY also entered the Democratic Party and initially offered using his employees to clean up, the party headquarters, and no charge. He was rewarding his community service with appointment services at the township by using the street lights committee and a whole bunch of stuff that he was doing in the community to basically supplement all his community service guidelines. GACY ended up murdering 33 young men and boys and buried 26 of them in a crawl space in his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals that he lured in Chicago from the Greyhound bus station. Simply off the streets and promised them a job at PDM, offered them drinks, drugs, money, sex. Some victims were grabbed by force. Others believed that GACY was a sheriff as he showed them a badge, like he was a policeman. GACY usually lured lonely victims into his home, although on more occasions, GACY had what was called doubles. So that means 2 victims killed in the same evening. Inside of GACY's home was usually like young people with drinks, drugs, or genuinely gaining his trust. He would then produce a pair of cuffs, and after he produced those pair of cuffs, and he was like, "You know what, I'm going to show you a trick." Sometimes he would do this trick in a clown outfit. He typically cuffed his own hand behind his back and then released himself with the key, which he hid between his fingers. He often would show victims that he could release himself with the handcuffs, and the victims basically wanted to try the trick, and they couldn't do what he did. GACY would make the statement, "The trick is you have to have the key." As he restrained those victims, GACY proceeded to rape, torture them, and keep them captive. He frequently began by sitting and straddling himself above the victim's chest before forcing the victim to basically oral him. GACY's infatuation with torture He would burn cigars in their bodies. He would basically sit on the backs and pull until they basically felt like the victim's arms were like ranges, like a horse. Gacy ended up frequently, he would put their ankles together and 2x4s and handcuffs were attached to them. He was inspired by the Houston mass murders. He also was known to verbally taunt them. Many victims throughout their continuous abuse had basically were dragged and forced several victims to crawl into the bathroom where he partly drowned them in the tub repeatedly, and he would basically assault them even more. So he went through all of this just to basically unalive these folks, unalive these men. Gacy typically did most of his murders by placing ropes on the victims, and he referred to the act as a rope trick. And occasionally, his victims, he would do this to his victims for an hour or two before they would die. Although several of his victims died from asphyxiation, cloth gags stuffed deep in their throats, expecting for him to finally, his last two final victims were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. After the death, Gary usually stored the victim's body under his bed for 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space, where he periodically poured quicklime to basically help decompose the victims' bodies. Some of the victims' bodies were taken to the garage and embalmed prior to their burial. Now, when I say your boy had all the murders, he did a lot. He did a lot. So, let's get into it. When basically he was put under investigations, and a lot of people, he didn't know, but the investigation was basically that one of the people that he assaulted was considered missing. And the missing persons report was basically with Des Plaines Police, and they named Gary as a contractor, and most likely left the store to talk to the young man about the job, Joseph. So the young man basically attended Maine West High School, and basically Gacy spoke to the mother and the father. And that morning on December the 12th, Joseph became a convinced runaway because they hadn't heard from him after Gacy approached the mother and father about the job. A routine check of Gacy's criminal background revealed that he had outstanding battery charges against him and served prison sentences in Iowa for sodomizing a 15-year-old boy. Joseph and two other sets of parents ended up going to the police officers and was like, basically, we need you guys to go and investigate Gacy's home the following evening. So Gacy basically had seen two youth workers at the pharmacy, and he had asked them, whom believed to be persistent, whether they knew anything about remodeling materials behind the store. And he ended up offering them a job, and he only returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. as he left his appointment at the bookstore. GACY promised to come to the station later on that evening and confirmed that he needed to respond to the police about the two boys that he spoke with, including John. He told the police officers at the station, "You guys are very rude, and don't you have to respect, don't you got respect for the dead?" So at 3:20 a.m., the police got an arrival from GACY, and when he said that, oh, they ended up doing what they need to do, SVU style. Okay? They ended up getting the first warrant to search his home. So when they suspected Gary might be holding John and anybody else at his home unwillingly, the police obtained a search warrant for Gary's home by December the 13th. They searched his home and property, revealed very suspicious items, including several police badges and 6mm starter pistols, officers' drawers, and a whole bunch of stuff that it didn't necessarily say, you know what, he's a murderer, but it was just kind of weird. The investigators also found handcuffs, several books of homosexuality with titles, things such as The Great White Shallow, Pretty Boys Must Die. They found several pornographic films. They found more guns. They found an 18-inch dildo in Gary's bedroom. They found more bottles, more alcohol, and everything in his closet. Then they ended up finding like a little toolbox in the laundry room, and it had underwear that was too small for Gary to fit, which was located inside of his bedroom closet, which, again, they found it was weird. So they kept on his ass, okay? They ended up surveilling his home, his whereabouts, and everything of that nature for a couple of months just to kind of like catch him in the act. By December the 18th, Gary was beginning to display signs to strain from his consistent surveillance. He was basically looking tired, appearing anxious, and was drinking heavily. The afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office, prepared a $750,000 civil suit against the police, demanding that their case and their surveillance the same day, the serial numbers of the pharmacy's receipts, Gary's kitchen, traces of the 17-year-old collie that was living with him. Again, I don't know why in the hell these little boys keep living with him, but yeah. So they basically was in a countersuit between the police and GACY. The police ended up getting a second search warrant, and he informed the detectives that summer that they received that search warrant in 1977 at GACY's home. He had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of GACY's home. So he was already prepared for them to come in to do what they need to do. They basically, on December the 19th, they investigated and they served GACY his second search warrant of his home. That same day, GACY's lawyer filed another civil suit against the Des Plaines police, and the hearing of the suit was scheduled for December the 22nd. The afternoon, GACY invited the surveillance detective inside his home again and Officer Robinson to distract GACY with conversation, and Officer Solowski walked into GACY's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola TV that was set that the suspect belonged to, that TV belonged to one of the suspects that was missing. So they grabbed all of that evidence as much as possible. Now, on the evening of December the 20th, GACY drove to his lawyer's office and attended a scheduled meeting. and discuss the progress of the civil suit. On his arrival, Gacy appeared and immediately asked for a drink and basically grabbed a whiskey out of his car because he was prepared. And on his return, his lawyer asked what he had to discuss with him. Gacy picked up the copy on the desk and pointed to the front page article and covered the disappearance of Robert and said, "That boy is dead. He's dead. He's in the river." Gacy then proceeded to give basically his whole entire confession to his lawyer, saying what he did, when he did, how he did it, basically. He was taking no prisoners at that point. So, after being informed by the police that he had human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy's officers wanted to clear the air by adding everything. The lawyer's office confession, the information under the crawl space, the drawing that he drew and said where the body remains were at. They got his ass on all charges. He showed them the river that he dumped some of the bodies in. By February the 6th of 1980, he was charged with 33 murders, and he was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before a judge, and the jury was selected. And because of his extensive press cover in Cook County, at the request of the defense counsel, Gary spent over 300 hours with a doctor before the trial, and he underwent psychologist tests, and before the panel, basically they said that he was competent to stand trial. And Gary's attempt to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, the civil-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, the policeman called Jack, whom he referred to Bad Jack, and degrading scum. His lawyer opted to have Gary plead not guilty by reason of insanity to charges against him. But guess what? They was not having it. That was a done deal. Okay? Closing arguments, your boy was basically on death row. And that was it. Of course, he tried to do an appeal after he was incarcerated. Gary read numerous of law books, basically to try to appeal his arrest. And basically, December the 13th of 1978, he objected to his lawyer pleading insanity as a defense for the trial. And Gacy, he ended up getting some knowledge himself on 5 murderers. And he tried to basically make sure that he was not indicted for some of the murders. They ended up making sure that at this point, you know what, we cannot let you out of jail. You cannot be in here for life, but we gonna execute you at this point. So basically, hours leading up to his execution, a crowd estimated to over 1,000 gathered outside the correction center and vocally basically was ready for him to meet his maker. Some of those in favor of the execution wore t-shirts basically saying Gary's previous community service as a clown. They wore these shirts and was like, "No tears for the clown." The anti-death penalty protesters presented a silent candlelight visual for him. After Gary's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10th, 1994, his brain was removed and it was possessed, and it ended up being in possession of Helen, a witness for the defense and Gary's trial, who had interviewed Gary and several serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent psychopaths. His body ended up being cremated. The victims, of course, they never got their just due. Like I said, they found a whole bunch of the bodies. They tried to do rewards on them and everything like that. So they basically, in the summary of everything, they were able to date the murders. They were able to recover the bodies, and they were able to tell you the location of the body, because that's what he did when he confessed his the murders to his lawyer. So he wrote everything down. So Timothy Jack, who was 16, January the 3rd of 1972, he was discovered as body number 9, and he was in the crawl space. John Bakovich, he was 18, July the 31st, 1975. He was body 2, and he was found in the garage. Daryl Sampson was 18. He was dead on April the 6th, 1976, and he was considered body 29. He was in the dining room. Randall Wayne was 15. May 14th, 1976. He was considered body number 7. A lot of the bodies were in the crawl space. There were maybe like 4 or 5 in the Des Plaines River. And of course, there were more bodies, but they, of course, were unidentified victims. But they were also buried in Gary's crawl space, and one buried approximately 15 feet from the barbecue pit in his backyard, basically. So, of course, no one wants this to be them. And this is definitely not a good happy ending. And I honestly have to pray for those families. But his origin story was not the best to begin with. Tell me how you feel in the comments. What do you feel like should have been the end of this man's demise?